Hello and welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically beautiful Danville, Illinois. And I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today is July 1st. Rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. And it's a beautiful day here in central Illinois. It's much cooler than it's been. Today it is 74 degrees, which, considering it's been in the 90s, is really quite lovely. And I hope that you are having a lovely day wherever you are. And as you know, if you type your questions or comments into whatever platform you're watching this program on, they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And today, my first thought was to continue, in a manner of speaking, our conversation from Friday about civil rights and so forth, because this is here in the U.S. It's the lead up to Independence Day on July 4th, which I believe is Thursday of this week, and I thought that talking about our independence as pagans, using that term in the broadest sense, would be a good thing to talk about. But then I was reminded that today is the 21st anniversary of the Battle of Hoopeston, which is right on topic. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about that and what it has to do with where we stand as a community now. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. Hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. So what was the Battle of Hoopeston? As those of you who have been with us for a long time will remember, 21 years ago, we moved the Witch School headquarters from Chicago to the tiny town of Hoopeston, Illinois, which is about 45 minutes to half an hour to 45 minutes from Danville. And this seemed like a perfectly simple thing when we started, but radically became more complicated. And there was a huge conservative Christian reaction to the idea of the physical headquarters for the world's largest school of witchcraft and magic coming to a tiny Midwestern town. And on this date, 21 years ago, the local city council decided to address the subject. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. And as it happens, though we had not yet made this move, we were in town and came to attend that meeting. And it was a dystopian experience. I don't know that I've ever been surrounded by quite so much hostility in my lifetime. The room was packed to overflowing, largely with conservative Christians who were in a state of apoplectic outrage, and wanted us to know that this tiny community did not want a bunch of pagans opening up a headquarters there. Now, mind you, our local Corellian temple in Hoopeston had closed only a couple of months previous to this. We had been there for years. There were several other pagan groups in town too, they didn't know about. But it had never had this level of news coverage. And everything we do has news coverage. And the idea of establishing a physical quarters for Witch School that way was very newsworthy, and it was everywhere. And hello to Mystique in the chat room. Most of the people who spoke that night were vehemently opposed to our presence, had no understanding remotely of who and what we actually were, nor were they willing to be told anything other than their idea that we embodied all evil in the universe. There were a certain number of threats that were made that evening. There was a lot of threatening energy. And in the end, we literally had to be escorted out to our cars by the local police chief, who, to his credit, was very friendly and positive. And it was actually his actions after the meeting that led us to go ahead and establish that headquarters there. And we were there for several years. And It was a very interesting time. It was a very interesting night. We ended up staying the night here in Danville, certainly not in Hoopeston. But what we found out afterwards um, was that many of the people in that meeting were not actually from Hoopeston at all. Many of the local people who were present were afraid to speak. Um, Whole buses of conservative Christians had been brought into town from other areas to give the impression of a local reaction that was not local at all. Many of the local people were quite receptive to our being there, and in fact made an effort to let us know that this did not actually speak for their community. Now, unfortunately, it did speak for a minority in that community who turned out to be very powerful, but that's another story. What does this have to do with where we are now as a community? I was talking on Friday about how I think we're really looking at a far more feudal future than our past. What do I mean by that? Right now, already, and increasingly, I think, where we live determines in a lot of ways what freedoms we do and do not have. And this is obviously only going to become more so. Um, if you belong to certain minority communities, you are far freer as a citizen in certain parts of this country than you are in others. Whether you are part of a minority religion like ours, whether you are um, of a minority sexual expression, the LGBTQA community, whether you are of a minority race, your living conditions are much more heavily affected now than they were 20 years ago by what part of the country that you live in. And I strongly suspect in 10 years it's going to be far more the case. I regard this as a huge step backwards for this country. Um, I'm not entirely sure that we could be adequately described as a country in 10 years. There's a large portion of the nation who really want to move to the idea that we're really a combination of 50 separate countries. And right now we look a lot like that. And hello to Reverend Antonio in the chat room. And what's wrong with that? Well, if you're any one of those minority communities, crossing a state line drastically changes, even now, your level of freedom. And that's likely to become a more prominent problem in the future. I wish I could say otherwise, but as I was saying on Friday, I feel like in a lot of ways we've lost this battle. We haven't necessarily lost the war, though we're not in a good place to fight it. But the war isn't necessarily lost, but the battle certainly is. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. And we really need to look at how we're going to survive that. And it's going to take a lot of thought on the part of our community, which, to be honest, is not really known for deep thinking in these matters. Some of our traditions are. And I don't think the major traditions are going to have any particular difficulty surviving because they're capable of making unified responses. Um, and because we're not really high on the hit list, so to speak. But the community, unfortunately, a lot of members of this community thrive on the idea of being persecuted, so they'll probably embrace it rather than opposing it, which is a terrible thought, but I think something we're likely to see. Um, but what they should be doing is standing up for their rights as best they can, looking how to secure those rights in the different areas of this country, on the understanding that doing it at the federal level is not necessarily going to be as successful in the future as it has been in the past. We also need to bear in mind that those federal protections may not stand in coming years, which means that we have to be very cautious of our local protections. Mary Cavalcante says, how sad? Well, yes, it is. Um, we are in a very precarious position that, for the most part, we don't want to admit and don't want to deal with. But if we don't deal with it, it will deal with us. And hello to Brenda in the chat room. And as we look at the coming Independence Day, we are absolutely foolish if we don't look at maintaining our own independence. That means a lot of different things. Right now, I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about our political rights, our citizenship rights. But of course, a lot of this is economic. Um, you know what they say: money talks and BS walks. And if we look to our economic prosperity, that would go a long way toward possibly protecting our civil independence and our civil rights. But this is also not a topic that our community has ever been very good at. Um, and it's going to take some serious changes to become good at it. And so I don't mean to sit here and be the prophet of doom. And in fact, I don't think that I am. And I want to go back once again to that Battle of Hoopeston. It actually worked out perfectly fine for us, at least for a while. We did eventually have to leave Hoopeston, partly because of the entrenched prejudice of a minority, and also because of the way that the economy went. But certainly, we survived that battle. We survived that evening, and we thrived for a while. One of the reasons was we did not allow ourselves to be scared off the field. We did not allow ourselves to be overwhelmed. Maybe that night, but not really. We continued moving forward. We continued doing what we thought was the next right thing, and it carried us forward. And our community needs to do the same thing. I often refer to that story from very early in my pagan career about one of the first pagan spirit gatherings and how a group of armed protesters showed up at the gates threatening violence. And of the 300 some people who were present at this event, the vast majority ran off and hid in the woods, leaving Selena Fox and a handful of other organizers to handle this alone. And I mentioned this to Lady Selena last year, and she said, yes, I remember that. And she did, as it happens, handle it. She and the others handled it very well. But running off into the woods is not how you handle these things. What that does is increases your vulnerability. Because, if there are 300 of you in one place, you're a lot harder to take out than one person hiding alone in the woods. Even if there are 300 other people hiding, strength in the end lies in numbers. It lies in a certain amount of unity. And again, not something our community has been very good at, but some of our organizations are. I have the great good fortune to belong to a large and well-organized tradition, one of several large and well-organized traditions. I have the great honor of having been the leader of that tradition, well, one of the leaders, for 45 years, and still one of the leaders. And yeah, I feel that gives a certain amount of protection. But I do think that at this point in time, we need to be looking to where our protection lies, to what protects our independence, because it is not the wider country. We have had great good fortune during my time in this community at securing our civil rights, but we did it mostly by saying, oh, look, these people over here have been recognized as having these rights, and we're just the same as them. So we should have these rights too. And I don't know that that will protect us in the future. And we need to make sure that we have allies elsewhere in the political world, elsewhere in the religious world, or we will be standing alone in the woods. We need to be able to have enough of us able to work together that we can give some sense of a unified reaction to situations that might otherwise be overwhelming to us as a community. And we need to avoid certainly the kind of nonsense that tore this community apart in the 1990s. And I see people trying to do that again. And frankly, they just need to be shut up because they will destroy us if we allow them to. And Mystique says we really need to start coming together and have ways to communicate in secret. And, I agree with the first part. We need to start coming together much more strongly. And we definitely need to have ways to communicate. But I don't know that we need to be secret about it. And I'm not sure that that's our best course of action. But I do agree that we need to have lots of backup ways to communicate. And Mystique says, could you please elaborate what happened in the 90s? The identity wars happened in the 90s. Different traditions trying to tear all the other traditions apart over their differences and particularly different origins. The idea of who could call themselves Wiccan, who could call themselves a witch, who could call themselves pagan. And a lot of perfectly good people were destroyed in those internecine and very nasty fights. For what purpose? Did it make a stronger community? No. Did it make those traditions stronger? No, it weakened them. And if you look at the places physically in the country where these witch wars were at their strongest, those communities collapsed. A few times they resurrected themselves, but in many cases they left nothing but ashes behind. In Chicago in the 1990s, there were events that were drawing people by the hundreds and thousands. Today, most of them are lucky to get 30 people. Um, Now, hello to Alan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Alan. Alan says, get to know authorities on the local level in person and on a secular basis to protect your future. That is excellent advice, Alan. And Pete Pathfinder once said to me, and Pete was a good friend of mine, the founder of the Aquarian Tabernacle Church and Tradition, that when he moved the headquarters of the Aquarian Tabernacle to the tiny town of Index, Washington, the first thing he did was to go out and introduce himself to his neighbors as Pete. And the fact that they got to know him first as a person made it much easier for him to then explain to them what the church was. And getting to know people, particularly people in positions of authority, is a very wise thing to do. And do it in a way that they can understand. I've spoken about interfaith language previously on this program and elsewhere, and also how to present yourself. But you have to consider your audience and who you're speaking to. As my mother liked to put it, you have to meet them where you find them. And you can't think they're going to accommodate your differences. That's not going to happen in a first meeting. You need to speak their language if you're trying to win them over. I don't care if you think it's right. It's how it is. And that means that you don't want to be speaking lots of jargon. You want to use terms they will understand. Rather than talking about all the different deities, use terms like God and deity and spirit and things that they can identify with. Talk about services rather than ritual in your first meeting. You'll get farther. And do not have a giant sign above your head saying, I am different from you if you're trying to get their alliance. Um, and Pete also loved to tell the story of how when he first joined the um, the interfaith religious council in Washington State, the Interfaith Council of Churches, that a local pagan group objected to his doing so on the premise that he could not represent the pagan community. Now, he wasn't there to represent the pagan community, he was there to represent the Aquarian Tabernacle, but they still gave this group a chance to speak. And Pete said he was very nervous about this because he felt that joining that council was a huge accomplishment, and he did not want to lose the opportunity to move forward for the church and for the community. And he said he was very nervous until he got there. And he saw this other group sitting there dressed all in black and lots of silver jewelry. And he didn't say it, but probably with black dyed hair and heavy makeup. And he looked at the members of the Interfaith Council as they turned their eyes from this to him in his tweed coat and leather patches on the elbows. And he knew immediately that he was going to win that confrontation because he was speaking the language they could hear. And yes, there's a level where it's not right that you have to consider how you're dressing when you're meeting someone in a position of authority in order to be heard, but you do. And what is right has nothing to do with it. What will be successful is what matters. But success is something our community often does not like to look at. Now, Mary in the chat room says, why did we do that to each other in the 90s, the identity wars? And it was about power, pure and simple. They wanted to suppress everyone who challenged, certain groups wanted to suppress everyone who challenged their claim to superiority. But the problem is, they were fighting over tiny crumbs of power. They hadn't gained any power. There was nothing to fight over. They didn't even have the resources to survive independently, for the most part. So they fought their wars, and they did, in many cases, destroy their opposition, and then found they had no sustenance of their own. And certainly many of those communities had no sustenance to continue with. And some of those groups who were such adamant witch warriors, they're not there now, because in the end, they destroyed their own base as well as the people they thought of as their enemies. And their biggest mistake here was fighting over power that did not exist. They needed to work together to build power that might have been worth fighting over. But what they were fighting over was nothing. And that's what they came away with. And, some of the groups that were in positions of national leadership then are gone, or they're kind of crawling back to their former positions, or they'll never be in those positions again, and are just kind of continuing to exist with nobody in their membership under 60. And a lot of them are those elders that you hear about saying, why won't young people listen to me? Well, part of the answer to that is that when they were listening, you were acting like a bunch of children. And they did listen, and they said to themselves, we don't want this. And for some parts of our community to go forward, they really have to look at the things that happened then, what they did that was not successful, and they have to change it if they want to go forward. And then there are those of us who did go forward in more positive ways. And I'm not sure what to say in terms of what we as a community can do now, but we must reassess where we're going in the future, and we really need to come up with ways that we can answer the challenges we are facing. And although I am no longer in the position I was formerly in, I'm still one of the leadership of the Karelian tradition, and certainly a pagan leader at large. And so that question of how do we survive is very important to me. And that question of can the individual traditions survive if the community cannot come together? And my answer to that has always been yes, that we will find a way. My answer to everything has always been yes, we will find a way. Um, but how much better would it be if we could all work together and if we could avoid fighting over nonsense? And I would love to see anything that would help that. Um, Unfortunately, fighting in part is human nature. And particularly when people don't get what they thought they wanted, for example, in political conflicts, um, perhaps most of all in political conflicts, that they want to um, have bitter fights to the end that benefit no one. But if we could rise above that, we would be so much better off. Generally speaking, I've tried to do that, and I think if you look at my career, you'll see that it has been the right choice, and has well, it's why I'm sitting here talking to you. There are so many times I could have been caught in endless witch wars and chose not to take that route. And that would be one of my big pieces of advice to you. Don't don't punch down and don't battle with idiots because they'll drag you down to their level and beat you with their experience. As a priestess I was once quite close to used to love to say, and it's true. You need to find that next right thing to do. And Mary Hawk in the chat room says, we've got to come together as a community. As Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. And yeah, that's entirely possible. And that brings us back to the story of the pagans hiding in the woods. They may have felt safe hiding in the woods, but they were not. Um, some of them might have been, but hunting them down one by one would not have been all that difficult. And what would they do if that were what happened? That is not a defense. Hiding is not a defense, especially in this day and age. Might work for a few, not very many, and not the thing that we could do. And Mystique says, what do you feel could potentially unify North American pagans? I think unify is not necessarily the word that we want. What we want is to be able to work together. No one wants to lose their independence. No one wants to feel that they are giving up any part of of their own individuality. But we can still find ways to work together, I hope. And Mystique says, is there a common truth we all share? Well, there's one common truth we all share, and I've remarked on it several times. And that is that while whatever differences may separate us, we have one thing in common: the people who hate us. And they hate all of us. And the people who are now teaching the Bible in the classrooms of Oklahoma have no room for us in their idea of what this country should be. And they are rising to power all over the place. Thankfully, not so much here in Illinois, which brings us back to the subject of today's show, the Battle of Hoopeston. They did not win that fight. They did eventually outlast us there, but I would not say they won the fight. And if you look at Hoopeston today, I'd have to say that they certainly are not better for the loss of us and numerous other um, businesses that they basically chased out of town because it wasn't what they thought was the right kind of people. And the town has only gotten poorer and gone farther downhill in the meantime. But that's what will happen in the places where Christian nationalists conquer. Um, you don't have to look very far in history to see that they do not build healthy and prosperous communities. They build fear and poverty, except for a handful who become very, very rich. And it's that handful of very, very rich people within their midst who are really pushing it. But that brings us to the end of our half hour today. And, I think this is a very, very unfortunate thing to have to focus on in this Independence Week. But honestly, if we don't focus on our independence, what's the point of an Independence Week? What's the point of celebrating our independence from Great Britain if we're still not free in our own backyard? Um, and as a community, we have been for a long time, but we must maintain that. And hello to Proxones in the chat room. It's good to see you. Tomorrow is going to be a best of, and it's going to be a replay of my recent interview with Corellian First Priesthood, the Most Reverend Alyssa Maxon Kemp, and the Most Reverend Phoenix Coffin Williams. You may have been at the Corellian town hall meeting last night. And if not, join us tomorrow to see some of the new things they have planned for the future. And I will be back on Wednesday with Chris Copeland. And I hope that, and hello to Ed the Pagan in the chat room who says, what a battle it was. Yes, it was. And of course, Ed was right there leading the pagan charge. And it was quite a night. And we may talk about it further. I don't know. We'll have to see. It was certainly a very important event in our lives. And Mystique says, we will prevail. Well, yes, that is certainly our hope. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. Have a lovely day. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we ask you to help us to always find that next right thing to do. Help us to find ways to come together and work together to safeguard our rights and independence as we go forward. Help us not to be overwhelmed by those who oppose our existence, but to stand tall and defend our existence against any who would remove us. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this and everything you do for us in our lives, and knowing you are always with us, still from respect, we thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always. And Midday with Reverend Don will be back tomorrow. I will be back live on Wednesday, and we will continue this adventure that we are having together.